Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome back. I feel like it's been a long time since we've seen you. It's been a few weeks since we've had Black Doctor Speak here with Dr. Michael LeNoir. Of course, I am Ellis Dean. I am the sidekick to Dr. LeNoir and all of his intellectual prowess, but I am so happy that you are here with us, and I'm happy to be back. And sometimes you do something for this is our 16th episode, if y'all believe that or not. And so sometimes you do some things so many times that you don't realize how much you're doing it, and you don't realize how much you miss it until you're not doing it. And so we've been off for a couple of weeks, but we are back and we are better than ever. And so we are so excited to be here today. And we have a few surprises for you as we continue to make this show, that it is for you and it's about you. And so you can speak directly to the expert. So I'm going to shut up because I know Dr. LeNoir is really trying to get back here and speak to you all. But I do want to say, before we get to Dr. LeNoir, please let us know where you're watching us from. Drop that in the comment section. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to see people from all over the country, and make sure you put your questions in the chat room. We love to get those questions and answer your questions, because that's what this show is all about, is Black Doctor speaking directly to you to give you the answers to your questions. So with no further ado, I welcome Dr. Michael LeNoir. How are you doing?
Well, was
that too long of an intro? Was that too long of an intro for you?
Yeah, well, I use an old school expression that you do miss the water till the well runs dry. And so the fact that we haven't been on the air for a number of weeks represents kind of a reorganization of our process. This is kind of our last product of this particular type. So we're going to, I think next week when we come on, we'll have new openings, new closes, we're rebranding. But we have a special guest tonight. We have Ms. Rachel Bryant. She's going to talk to us about aspects of mental health, and especially aspects of mental health in the pandemic. She's also going to be one of our hosts. So I would like to introduce to you Rachel Bryant. But before we talk to her for any length of time, let's talk a little bit about the coronavirus epidemic and the vaccination process. And it'd be interesting to know what you've been hearing from your audience about the coronavirus vaccinations. How things are going? Is there still as much hesitancy about getting the vaccine as there was in the beginning? And what can we do to make a difference in how those statistics ramp up?
It's interesting. I think in the beginning, there's been kind of come full circle. And that full circle has been, in the beginning, there was a tremendous amount of hesitancy, people saying no, they were not going to get the vaccine. And then the pendulum swung in the other direction, and people are getting vaccinated. The reality is that, people are getting vaccinated. Now, Black people aren't getting vaccinated at the rate of our population, and that has been disturbing. And so we've had some programming here on blackdoctor.org to try to help stem that, because we've heard, and I don't know if you've seen the reports about line jumping, where people from other communities are going into predominantly Black and brown communities and getting vaccinated. And the reason why they're able to do that is because once they open up that crate, especially the Pfizer vaccine, it has to be held at a very cold temperature. So once they open it up, it's only good for a short amount of time. And so if people are missing their appointments or not setting the appointment, they're allowing other people to come in and get vaccinated because they have to use it or lose it, or it's not good. And so there has been some line jumping going on. But the people that are wanting to get vaccinated, the people that are getting vaccinated, they're not talking as much. The people that are talking more now are the people that are still, anti-vaccine. And so that's been interesting to see, that there still is a large group of people that are ascribing to conspiracy theories about the vaccine. And, if I can be candid, what I don't like about that is when you ascribe to a conspiracy theory, you're really saying to all of these Black doctors that have dedicated their lives and their career to the health and wellness of Black people, that all of a sudden now in 2020 and 2021, they do not have Black people's best interest in heart. That's how it's landing on me. I know that's not what people are saying, but that's how it's landing on me. And I think, I don't like that. I don't like that because I know how hard you have worked in your career, Dr. LeNoir, just from knowing you, and just to think that you would all of a sudden give people advice that is not true or that has
I think African Americans are pretty wise to some of the things that are going on. But I also think that they have the right to make good decisions and decisions for themselves. I don't think that I can criticize them if they choose not to get the vaccine. What I can do is just express my concern that if you don't get the vaccine, then you're going to have some major problems just moving through life. If you're not vaccinated, then eventually I think what's going to happen is that A, you're still at risk for getting serious problems from the coronavirus. Not just those that end up in the emergency room or the hospital or the intensive care unit, but you hear from a lot of people who've had the active infection that they're still not okay. I don't know whether you've heard that, Rachel, but that's what I'm hearing from my friends. Once they get the infection, they're still not okay. The other thing that I'm concerned about, and it hasn't happened yet, is it's going to be like seat belts or other things, that eventually you're not going to be able to get on a plane, go to a concert, go to an educational lecture, or go to religious services without showing the fact that you've been vaccinated. So I think that's another process. I think we have 3 vaccines now. We have certainly the Pfizer vaccine, which doesn't require as much nurturing as it used to. We also have the Moderna vaccine, and now we have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a one-shot vaccine. A lot of people are concerned about the fact that its efficacy doesn't seem to match the other 2 vaccines. But what we do know is in all the studies, it kept people out of the hospital, it kept people from dying. And it's a one-shot vaccine. So for those populations that can't get vaccinated, I think it's a good alternative. Not alternative, it's a good vaccine. So I think that African Americans, we just need to keep giving information, and let them decide based upon that information what they choose to do. Rachel, I'm going to introduce Rachel Bryant to our audience. She's going to be one of our hosts on a regular basis. Rachel, what have you been hearing about the vaccine and your pod?
It's interesting. I spoke to my mom, who is 78 today, and she got the vaccine, and I'm really happy about that, especially with our seniors who oftentimes have caregivers and family members. But she was saying about half of her friends her age are refusing to get the vaccine. There's just this fear. They don't want to be in the first round. But everyone that I know who's gotten the vaccine has felt a sense of relief, a sense of greater freedom to move around in their life. And I can't wait to get my own vaccine, especially because I'm working, I will eventually go to work in groups of people. So I think you're right, Dr. LeNoir. We need more education and information. And I think slowly the community is coming around. But of course, as you said, everyone has that individual choice to make what's best for them based on a number of reasons.
One of the things that is concerning me, well, not concerning me, but we were one of the first, the African American Wellness Project was one of the first few organizations to say the teacher should be vaccinated first, along with the other first line responders. Because obviously people want their children back to school. A lot of them are concerned about face-to-face learning, but a lot of them just want babysitting for their children so they can go back to work. But regardless of that, I always thought the teacher should be in the first line. What do you think, how safe do you think it is for our children, especially urban and city children, to go back to school? What do you think from your experience, Mr. Dean? What do you think, Rachel?
I'll jump on that first. I think it's with children not being vaccinated, and from a lot of the programs that we've done here, and from what I've read, is that the first strain, I'm going to speak to the first strain of COVID, is that children weren't catching it as easily as adults. That's what I heard. That's what I learned. And so, but in terms of putting them in harm's way, I just wish there was a uniform kind of decision being made. So I can speak to my own example. My son, his school went to hybrid, so they were 2 days on, 1 day off, 1 day off. Then they were home for a couple of weeks, and now they're fully in person. But we have to fill out the form every day and take his temperature and before he goes into school. They're still having outbreaks, and so I think there is this push-pull thing going on where people want their kids in school for learning purposes, and communities want their kids in school because that allows parents to go to work and all the other kind of things that precipitate when kids are in school every day, plus the babysitting that you're talking about. But then there's also this pull that says, I don't want to put my child in harm's way. They potentially get it and bring it home and infect the entire home. And so that's where the struggle is. I don't know what the decision is. I just want them to be kind of uniform decisions, because it's all over the place in every different city.
And Reggie, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I am so happy that I am not trying to work from home with small children in the house. I think this is a great stressor developmentally. Also, children need to be with one another, right? I can understand the parents, as you said, maybe wanting their kids to go back to school for the care, but I also think that it's really healthy for children. And when we think about mental health of children developmentally, they need to be with one another. So I see that. I work in higher ed, and I was just reading an article today that some of the folks in higher ed were the line jumpers for the folks working in K through 12 education, because at first it wasn't clearly defined when they said people working in education. They had to go back and specify that they were really talking about like folks working in K through 12 education. As it rolls out in higher ed, again, we're a different dynamic. Much more able to lend ourselves to a virtual environment and to, wait until we go back into the classroom with adult learning. But I think a lot of people want the kids, including the kids, to go back to school soon as it's safe.
Yeah, I didn't realize that growing up that being in school was more than just an education. It's socialization, it's friendships, it's bullying, it's all of the things that you have to deal in life on a kind of a gradual basis. And so I think that in addition to the educational issues, I think those issues that have to do with the development of relationships, whether you're talking about elementary school or you're talking about middle school, especially if you're talking about middle school, and if you're talking about high school. And so consequently, I think that it's really important. I didn't realize how much development takes place in that process because I went through it. And obviously it was more natural. But I do think that what we're missing in this whole process is that socialization piece along with that educational piece. Mm-hmm. So consequently, I do think that it's important to get kids back to school. But I do understand the position of the teachers. I mean, I understand the fact that they don't want to be at risk, but I do think that we should have educated them along with the first responders. All right, so I'd like to move now into our discussion today with Ms. Rachel Bryant. She is a mental health specialist and diversity and wellness practitioner. I want to talk to her a little bit about her journey into mental health, what she's learned about the mental health system, and how she has decided, how she has would advise people who are really involved now in trying to cope with this situation to move forward. So, Rachel, glad to have you. Want to introduce you. You'll be seeing the people who will be seeing you on a regular basis as you interview people. You're especially in mental health. But let me ask you, how did you get involved in mental health? What was your journey like?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. Before I talk about that, I would like to just say a little bit about myself. And I think as this conversation unfolds, we will see why this is relevant. So hello, thank you so much for welcoming to the fold here in the show. I'm Rachel Bryant. I'm a Blaxican from Oakland, love my hometown of Oakland, and have many good connections there. My folks are from Hope, Arkansas. They came to California searching for warmer suns. And I think that that's a really relevant conversation to position ourselves when we introduce ourselves to communities. This is how I work when I'm working in community mental health and working on social justice projects in my community, that I give a little bit about myself. And that's sort of antithetical to the way I was trained as a therapist. But to your question, Dr. LeNoir, how did I become a therapist? That has carried me through my whole career because I was doing assessment work and focus groups and planning around how to spend new mental health care dollars in California. And it took me to my home in East Oakland at an organization called Youth Uprising. And Youth Uprising was centered right in deep East Oakland to support youth who were experiencing high levels of violence, school dropout, all of the things that we know impact our youth in urban communities. And I was doing a series of focus groups, talking to the youth. And as we were wrapping up, this kid said to me, he said, "Well, Ms. Rachel, why can't you be my therapist?" And I said, "Say more about that." He said, "Well, you know, when Karen comes from outside of the community, I can see the fear in her eyes when I start telling her what's going on in my household or my community." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "And if it's not that, she doesn't even believe me. Like, there's the folks from outside don't even believe when I start to describe the circumstances that my life is situated in." And the other thing he said was that, or it becomes like an episode of The Wire. It becomes very voyeuristic. Those are my words, not that youth's words, but like therapists from outside the community could tend to be like, "And then what? And then what?" And so I decided to become that kid's therapist. That's as simple as that. And that is what held me every time it got hard. When I was in my master's program, and I always go back to that story of why I became a therapist. It was because it was a calling. And I think you shouldn't be in any of the health fields if there's not some sense of calling to that work.
Now, when I was less more naive, I used to think about therapy in terms of the European lying on the couch, conscious, unconscious stuff. But how did you feel that your training was relevant for African Americans?
You know, I have so many memories. I can remember sitting in my classroom thinking I could diagnose my whole family in here, right? Like I could just figured the whole thing out, how I came to be the way that I am. And I remember feeling that I don't think I had any Black professors in my training program in psychology. There was very little mention of Black psychology, which I later came to learn. And really, the biggest thing was it was so hard to translate my classic psychodynamic Freudian education when I went back into East Oakland working with youth, right? I had the double burden of trying to translate Western European theories into the communities that I was working with. And so I think the other thing is just the general stigma around mental health and going into the field. My whole family didn't know what I was doing, like still don't understand the concept of mental health. You know, like that's what you have family for, to talk about your problems with them. And so to answer your question around that, I think it's not culturally appropriate at times to do one-on-one therapy with people. Certainly, there is a need. I have my own individual therapist, but as a whole, we're communal people. And Euro theories don't include the family and the community. They don't include spiritness. They don't acknowledge ancestors. And so there's a lot of things that just didn't translate from the way that I was trained into the way that I needed to practice.
You know,
Good.
no, it's interesting you bring that up because I don't know if I ever told you this, Dr. LeNoir. I have a master's in counseling, and so I was doing a lot of the same work that you were doing, that you're doing, Rachel. I was working and counseling children and adolescents, primarily Black children and adolescents in the inner city here in Atlanta. And that was one of the things when I was applying for PhD programs. I would tell them what I wanted to study, what I wanted to do. And they would say, we don't know if we have a professor here that we could pair you with that could help you with your study, with your area of interest. And that was always the kind of the blocking, and I don't know if it was intentional or unintentional, that was always that kind of blocked me. They were like, we really like you as a student, but we just don't know if we have a professor that can fit you into their program, because they were studying all other things, but they weren't studying what I wanted to study, which was the self-esteem of Black children and how learning, my point was learning your history of your people and yourself would help you perform better in school because you would have a higher self-esteem. And so they, so I definitely understand what you're talking about, what you're going through, but how do we overcome that as a people in terms of, is it more that we work on the training side of therapists, or do we find, or do we just work on creating more Black therapists to be able to treat our communities?
That's a good question. I think back in the 70s, the Black psychiatrists walked out of the American Association of Psychiatrists for that very reason. And the fact is that obviously the solution would be more Black therapists. What do you think, Rachel? Why are there not more?
Yes, they did walk out. Yeah, and I just want to give big props to ancestor Dr. Joseph White, who was the person that founded the Association of Black Psychologists that came as a result of that. I made the shift from practicing in communities to working in higher ed so that I could recruit and train and teach community mental health the way that I thought that it needed to be done. But believe it or not, those training programs are still primarily Western European theories, and we are slowly starting to introduce Black psychologists, and it's not limited to that. I think one of the myths about Black psychologists is that it's just for Black people, but it actually is good scientific information. It's good theories for a lot of people of color and for white clinicians. I think one of my frustrations was I wasn't trained to work with my community, and I also wasn't trained to work with all of the white people who actually showed up for their appointments working in community mental health either. So there's really an issue with our training programs.
So what is the problem in trying to get more Black therapists to train, or we get more Black people interested in the field of psychology and psychiatry?
I think, as we said, you have to see yourself reflected in the curriculum, the pedagogy, and the professor. That's one hurdle there. But I also think there's a lot of stigma, not only about mental health, but actually about becoming a mental health practitioner. Oftentimes, the people who came in to diagnose have done harm. And so people are suspicious, like I said, of even taking this career path. There's stigma around taking the career path because people don't know that there's Black psychologies, that there are theories that are actually relevant to our culture, our practices, our norms, our spiritness, and our communities. So I think it's twofold. And I think the other thing is, I just want to lift up that we also know how to take care of ourselves. So I think it's a both and. I think while we do need professional help, I also just celebrate and want to honor all the people who find ways to live in their joy with whatever circumstances that they have. That's always been our survival strategy. So I think it's a both and, a professional approach and a communal approach to our wellness.
If I can add just a little piece of that, I think that also that there is a disconnect, and you were speaking to that earlier, Rachel. There's a disconnect between traditional counseling methodology and being able to counsel, Black and brown people, and we're really dissecting a huge part of who we are, what's salient to our people and to our being, in traditional modes of therapy. And so we do have to, if we're talking about training, if we're talking about training therapists, yes, we need more Black therapists, but we need to train other therapists in that piece of, okay, if you're going to have a Black or brown client, then you need to understand this about their makeup, their mental makeup, and then that's how you're going to have to treat them differently. You're going to have to approach them differently, ask them questions differently, and understand that their experience here in this country is real and not just some sort of movie things you see in a movie or that you hear on TV. It's not really real. And so I think that's a big piece that we're kind of missing in the whole kind of industry of therapy.
And there's another piece of it, is that so often when we are diagnosed with mental illness, there are other things going on. And we don't have a job, we don't have a family situation. Did you encounter some of those things, some of those dynamics when you start to talk to people? You realize that there's nothing wrong with them mentally, there's just a lot of other stuff that's going on. And how do you
That's
feel about
right.
that?
And yes, I think we have to begin to pathologize ourselves through mental health, right? And come from a strength-based perspective. That's what I was saying. At one point, I realized I could diagnose my whole family, and I had to step back from that. There's nothing wrong with us. When I was working with youth in East Oakland, they wanted youth who had serious mental illness, who had diagnosis, right? But they wanted the same thing that all kids their age wanted. They wanted jobs. They wanted girlfriends and boyfriends. They wanted relationships. They wanted to find a place to live on their own. And so I think when we focus on our strengths, right, that goes a lot longer than just pathologizing and figuring out what's wrong. Unfortunately, in the mental health care system, it's a fail-first system. Oftentimes, we don't even get the services that we need when we need professional help unless there is a serious diagnosis. And that's just the way that the mental health care system, as I've experienced it, work. So oftentimes it has to reach a level of crisis, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so yeah, I think when you sit down and talk to people and they've been acting out or they've been certainly in school situations, you find out that there's some circumstances that would make anybody a little edgy, you know, if you start to really kind of get into the depths of the situation. In your experience and your training, how has the COVID epidemic changed the dynamic? Well, before we go that far, let's talk about stigma. One of the things that I think is really important about whether or not we get adequate mental health services to our community is the stigma of mental health in our community and what that means when you try to enter the system. How do we overcome the fact that you don't have to really, you're not necessarily categorized as crazy simply because you seek help in the mental health system? How do we get past that? I think that's a real big problem in the African community and probably in every community.
I think we need to talk about it more, right? We need to be more transparent about our suffering. I know that for myself, I grew up, be a strong Black woman, suck it up, hold it in, don't cry, don't let them ever see crack out there. And I think that we have to overcome that part, that it's okay for us to be help seeking when we need it, whether that's with our friends and family, and to know the difference when that turns into a professional situation. Oftentimes, the first line responders for mental health in Black communities are the spiritual community, like the minister and things like that. And so I think that's also a good place to start to do education, because a family will go where they trust. An individual will go to the person they trust, that they've known generationally. And so I think there's some work that can be done there as well to educate folks to know the difference when someone's just having a bad spell or when someone really may need medication or a more serious intervention for their well-being. And that needs to be done with a lot of compassion and empathy and cultural respect as well.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that, because I actually went and did the spiritual. We had a Stevens ministry, and that was our counseling ministry. And so anybody could be part of it. You had to go through a training and get accepted into the program, but anybody could be any of the parishioners could be a part of that Stevens ministry. And so I joined it, and with my formal training, it really did help. But I did see more people at least in our community, in our church, going to that ministry versus getting, kind of individual counseling. And so it's really, really interesting to see that dynamic. But you're absolutely right. We've got to talk about it more. But we've all been, living our lives by that, Paul Laurence, Dunbar poem, "Wear the Mask," right? And so I think that's the messaging that we get in our homes, that you got to go out there and you got to put on that brave face and you got to put your head down and keep grinding. And those of us that have those breaks, that have those moments of anxiety or depression or anything like that, that's the one person that goes back in the back room. He wasn't strong enough. He or she wasn't strong enough. And then the rest of us keep pressing on, and that they don't get treated. They just get, moved to the side. People to survive.
My father had a philosophy. My father was fairly straightforward in his thinking, and he believed everything he thought was science. But he said, Black people don't go to psychology, they just drink and go to church. That was his basic philosophy. But one of the things that I think is difficult, especially in the present environment, and we'll focus on that just a little bit more, is how can you tell the difference between stress and distress? What are some of the things that that people can point to say, okay, I'm kind of slipping in the darkness?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think excessive use of any coping strategy, whether it's a substance or food or anything, like any sort of addictive pattern where there's a loss of control. I think when people start losing sleep and they no longer have look forward to their day, like those are signs of distress. When you're no longer enjoying your life the way that you used to, I think that those are early warning signs, and we need to know ourselves and one another enough to know when to call that out. Some of the other signs is when people are either failing in school and work, like calling in sick a lot. Like, again, like these are some of the signs, not necessarily, but they are some of the early warning signs that there could be more distress than stress, than everyday stress going on. Changes in eating patterns, sleeping patterns, and, just the enjoyment of life.
Our special guest today is Rachel Bryant. She's a mental health professional, diversity counselor. Also, Mr. Ellis Dean, who has a deep training in the same areas. If you've got questions, just go into the chat room and type in your questions. If you've got a comment to make, this is a program about you. And so consequently, we'd like for you to get involved and to stay involved. You got any questions in the chat room, Mr. Dean?
Not at this moment. I think the key word, and you correct me if you disagree, is that impairment, right? And so I think that's the key word to what you're talking about between stress and distress, is that if you're experiencing some sort of impairment, whether it's a disruption of your social functioning, a disruption of your occupational functioning, your educational functioning, disruption of sleep pattern, eating pattern, anything like that, that's significant disruption, and has some sort of impairment, then that's really a telltale sign. It's hard to, when the bucket is full, but you don't know all the drops that got the buckets to be full. And so that's the hard thing about it, is that when you're on that road, when you're going down that slope, you don't know, because it's a drop at a time. And so that's the question I have for you, Rachel, is how does somebody be able to identify when they're on that road, if it's a slow road and not a fast road?
Well, many of us find ourselves on that road. It's not the first time. So I think when we're well is a good time to write down and keep a journal of what it looks like when we're well, what we know our patterns are in our early. It's almost like an advanced directive that they do in healthcare, but for mental health. I think it's really important. I have one of these, to know what those signs are, to know what's helpful. so that you can refer to that. Who's helpful? Because sometimes when we're in distress, we don't want you to call who you think might be the obvious person to come and to support us as well. I think that though oftentimes our loved ones know our patterns, and I think we have to be open to that feedback as well. When the people around you start giving you clues that something's a little different with you, I think we ought to pay attention to that, because those are the people that know us and love us. You notice I didn't say that, like, obviously some aspects of mental health also involve like auditory, visual hallucinations and things like that. Those things aren't always distressing. So also the person experiencing those, they're distressing usually to the culture and the people around us, but they may not necessarily be distressing to the person experiencing them. Some people experience those as spiritual emergence or hearing like voices that are telling them good things. So I think the person also has to know like when it becomes an issue from them. And again, I love what you said. It's around your functioning. And when that becomes debilitating for you, or hopefully way before that, you know when it's time to seek professional help. But in and of itself, mental health care symptoms aren't always necessarily distress.
Right.
And what role does, obviously, we talk about it a lot, what role does racism play in just the general overall mental health of African Americans? I mean, let me tell you why I'm asking that question.
Yeah.
Because obviously everybody, oh, racism. What really impact does racism have on the general mental health of African Americans in this country? And it's just, and it doesn't have to be. It's just your impression. It doesn't have to be something.
Well, and I'm going to use a little European kind of theology here. That says there's I think it was Carl Jung that talked about the collective unconscious, right? And so that is a kind of a shared experience between people, and people of color, especially Black people in this country, have a shared experience that is distressful and has really been passed down from generation to generation as a kind of a collective PTSD. So even though I personally didn't experience slavery, I've experienced it through the experiences of my ancestors, and having those stories passed down from grandparents and parents about what they could do and what they couldn't do. Couple that with what's happening today. George Floyd activates that universal stressor that all Black people have in this country. When we see the murder of George Floyd play out on television, that activates that collective stressors, and that could push some of us over the edge that we're already stressed. Every day when we go to work, when we have those microaggressions, Black women talk to me all the time when they say, "Can I touch your hair?" That's a microaggression that Black women have to face. And we have to swallow that, because if we respond in a negative way, all of the stereotypes of being the angry Black woman come into play. And so all of those things, I had a story the other day. I posted on my social media, and I went to a restaurant with my son. We had poor service. And I sat there and thought about, should I tip less as a reflection of the poor service? But then I started thinking about all of the stereotypes about Black people and tipping. And so I went to this whole back and forth, that I shouldn't have to dedicate mental energy to. If you have bad service, you should just cut the tip or talk to the manager. But all of the connotations that come with being a Black man with a son, and being the angry Black man, and them kind of misconstruing some of my statements or whatever, I said, you know what? I tipped the normal 15% and walked out of the door. But I had to make that consideration. So that's the role that I think racism plays. Rachel, you can take it from there.
Yeah, what you're describing is internalized racism. And then there's also like the racism that really exists when you don't get a job because of your name or your skin tone, when you don't get an apartment, when you don't get opportunities. And that's structural racism. And I love the way that this generation, like generations before, continue to chip away at that. Again, I'm talking about depathologizing ourselves. We're having a natural human response to sustained trauma and oppression. not just in the United States, but like it's global now. Like it's bigger than just even Black people. But we're talking about Black people today. But I think there's a collective struggle for liberation from structural racism and oppression. And as a result, you very well describe what internalized racism. Remember Willie Lynch papers? Like after a while, they don't even have to do it to you. You already expect less of yourself. You already expect to not get that job. You are already like self-defeating because of that generation and generation after trauma. And I apologize. We were laughing when you asked the question, Dr. LeNoir, but it was more like, where do we even begin to talk about the impact of racism? Racism, oppression, trauma is very real, and it's not a laughing matter, and it cannot be ignored. Right. And so I think even as health practitioners, we're not only, I personally feel like my work is at the intersection of education, social justice, and psychology, and I try and work on all of that fronts. And I think that's why we're having this show. So
we have a question now, Dr. LeNoir. We have a question here. I'm going to put it on screen. This is from Shonda. Thank you for watching and thank you for your question. Is it advisable to share that you see a therapist with your children, younger or as they mature?
Yeah, I think more importantly, it's probably advisable to talk to your children at the developmental level that they're at of what you're experiencing, right? I think that, again, we're saying that silence doesn't increase our health. So I think it's more important if you're having some mental health challenges that are impacting your family, that you talk to your children about it so that they don't internalize any part of that maybe they're doing something wrong, and they're likely worried about you as well. So I think more important than talking to them about whether or not you have a therapist or not is to talk about what's really going on in the families and that they're a part of that conversation as appropriate. That said, I do think that older children, it is okay. I think the fine line there is that our children are not our therapists. When we feel like we're leaning into someone that doesn't have the capacity to understand grown-up problems is exactly the time to get a therapist and to work with a therapist, and then to bring that refined message back and that healing back to your family in general. But I think talking to your children, if there's obvious things going on with what's appropriate, so that they just have an understanding and they're not afraid for you or worried about you is appropriate.
You know, I think one of the things that we don't do as much as we should is to teach our children what racism looks like. I remember when I used to go shopping with my girls. I had 4 girls, and fortunately, I got some help very quickly. But when I was a single parent of 4 girls, I would take them shopping. And whenever there was any evidence of discrimination, I would bring over the salesperson or the individual. I said, look, you better get this goddamn manager and come over and bring him over here right now and tell him I'm about to turn. I'm sorry, this cable. I mean, this is a Facebook Live. But anyway, so I said, you better bet that manager. Bring him over here right now. Right now, I want to talk to him about what you've just done. And she'd go, and then the manager come rushing over. And I pull the manager and said, now, I don't know what's wrong with her. She seemed to have lost it. She was, yelling and screaming, and she was out of control. And I said, I don't know exactly what's wrong here. And then he'd look at her, and he'd go over to her, and he would jam her after I had jammed her. Because you have to teach your children what racism looks like. I think it's too often right now we see youngsters who are raised without understanding and recognizing racism, even when they see it in a fairly blatant fashion. And I think that's the first step toward dealing with it.
Mm-hmm. And that's
mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to add to your answer to the question we had is like you also have to give the full context, especially at the age of the child, right? So give them age appropriate context, and then also don't just say I'm stressed, right? That's too open ended, and that leaves that up to the child to draw their own conclusion. Yes. Give them to hey, mommy's having some stressors, daddy's having some stressors, but I'm seeking help, and then talk about how that help is benefiting them. So now we've given the context of the therapy to where your child is like, okay, they're not afraid of it, they understand it, and it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end that says they're getting help, and it's a positive thing, not just I'm stressed and I'm seeing somebody. So don't leave it open-ended for children, because if they fill in the blank, their brains aren't developed enough to be able to fill in that blank appropriately. And so you've got to do that for them, especially if they're younger.
Very good.
What are you seeing now that we're in this for a year into this coronavirus COVID-19 epidemic? What kinds of problems are you seeing as a result just of the staying in, being social distancing? I understand that probably there's a big problem with loneliness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I want to begin first by just expressing my love and concern and sympathy for anybody that's been directly impacted by coronavirus, who might be on the show or listening. You know, our hearts are united. Our community will get through this together. And so I wanted to just express that first. I thought about this question, and I think that there's grief. There's a lot of grief for the loss of, we're experiencing collectively a lot of loss, not just of sometimes human life or a loss of health, but a loss of income at times, a loss of freedom to move around the cabin freely, you know, a loss of all of the things that we considered normal. And there's also all of this ambiguity. We just also in the time of the coronavirus went through a lot of political movement. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. But I think two of the greatest things are probably grief, and specifically for people who are very isolated, the isolation as well. And I think that our grief in particular is like compounded. We have soul level, soul wounds is what I call them, soul wounds of grief, right? For generations. And then we now have a situation where we're experiencing collective grief and loss and uncertainty about our future. And so important for us to talk about these things with one another. And I'm so grateful for all of the virtual platforms that people are figuring out new ways to get connected. We have found that some people find that they can actually access mental health care now because they don't have to be in person. And so it makes it more accessible, either by telephone or by Zoom or whatever. They're able to connect to more resources, more peer support spaces where people are talking about what they're going through, or maybe engage in other activities. I personally used to have a 3-hour commute every day. That freed up a lot of time to do things that keep me well, healthy, and to focus on my well-being. And so I think there's a silver lining to all of this, despite the grief, the loss, and the uncertainty that we're still facing.
I think the pandemic adds a tremendous amount of stressors, because it's another log on the fire, right? So as a Black person in America, you know, okay, I've got to avoid encounters with the police because I don't know how that's going to turn. I've got to, you know, there's so many pitfalls in just the navigating the world, this American world. So now there's another log on the fire with the pandemic, and this one that you can't see. You don't know when you're going to come encounter it. If you can encounter it, you don't know how much it's going to affect you. You know the numbers. We all know the numbers that Black and brown people are more affected by the pandemic than any other race. We're dying at a higher rate, and we're the frontline workers. We've talked about that on this program. And so that is, now you've got this invisible threat that we don't know if there's an end to it. And then we're getting all this advice about vaccine, and we know about our history with healthcare. And so that all of that is just the mental stresses that we have to go through every single day.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions. We have Darcy, who has been in the chat room asking about the impact of isolation. And what I'd like to couple that question with is the fact that now, because of telemedicine and the ability to communicate over the internet, there are ways in which you can get help that we not only in just direct contact, but also with some of the apps and other things that are available. Can you speak a little bit to the isolation issue and to some of the technology that's now available to people who really are feeling alone and afraid?
You know, I don't know all the apps. I know there are quite a few apps, like meditation apps, wellness apps, symptom checker apps for mental health, where you can actually chat as well. There's actually, I don't know what it's called, but like you can chat with a mental health care provider as well. And I think that just depends on your generation. I really see younger people maybe engaging through these virtual sites more. When I think about the isolation of some of our elders, they're not going to engage that way. And I think so there's certain folks that are hit a lot harder with the isolation. If you live alone during the coronavirus, right? You don't have family that even knows how you're doing day to day. When is the last time you received a hug? I live alone, and I sometimes wonder that, like, just that human contact is really hard in this situation, being isolated. And I think there is a silver lining to some of this, that people are finding new ways to connect. But I think there's also populations that aren't going to connect through apps and telehealth and things like that. And so we do what we've always done, and that is take care of each other. I know that churches and things like that have telephone trees where they call folks. I've received a few cards from folks I didn't even know in the mailbox. Thank you to whoever's doing that kind of stuff. Like, it's so important that we fill the gap where perhaps the mental health care system cannot. And I say that that's what we've always done. That's how we have survived, and part of our resilience.
And I learned this recently. Taraji Henson, the actress, she has a mental health foundation that's named after her father, who suffers from mental health disorders. And so she's raised enough money to where, like, if you can connect with her foundation, then she provides, I think, up to 5 free therapy sessions for people that are connected to her foundation. And she's doing that all over the country. And so I would say, if you want some services, or if you need some services and don't have the resources to engage, look up her foundation and try to connect to the services there available at her foundation.
Great resource.
Yeah, I think there are a lot more resources now. I think that there's some advantage in the new telehealth circumstances, because it can really kind of overcome some of the stigma, because it seems there's a certain ignominy about being involved at that particular level. But I do think that we need, and a lot of important things have come out of this conversation. Obviously, the training for many of the psychologists who see our people, or who even take care of our people, they don't have the same kind of approach on training that is necessary in order to be particularly effective. I think the second thing is that their careers in mental health are really good careers, and people ought not to be turned back by the fact that there's this stigma about the fact that if you go into a career in mental health, you have to have some major mental health problems yourself. I think that the willingness to help people, I think as a Black doctor, we've been psychologists all along. I mean, there were no other psychologists, and we gave out advice. I don't know how good the advice was all the time, but many people depend upon us and their ministers and spiritual leaders for advice. And I think that we ourselves need better training as to how to deal with some of these other issues. I think people do need to learn what the difference between stress and distress, and be open about the fact that they need help, and then we need to make it easy and available for them to know where to go to get it. So I think a lot has come out of this conversation, and I think we need many more conversations like that. Yeah. And I'm hoping that the addition of Ms. Bryant to our team will help us to gather together some of the more important issues in mental health, as well as some of the issues on women's health and things that she's interested in. So
she's a keeper.
You think so? Well, we have to discuss that after the show is over. I mean, we have to look at the details of the answers and figure out exactly.
Well, I'm going to give her some flowers here while she's here on the show, and this is just a testament to everything. This is from one of the people that are watching. And she says, I love how open and honest you guys are about mental health issues. This is such a negative stigma of mental health in the Asian community. It is a taboo subject to discuss, and because of this, there's very little room for healing and unity. Asians can learn so much about advocacy from you. Thank you for being an inspiration for all minorities. And so we want to say thank you for that, Esther. Continue to be an advocate, continue to be a voice in your community. And we're going to continue to understand that this show is a program for everyone. We talk about Black issues, but this program is for everyone because we all are in the struggle together on this planet.
And I'd like to thank Esther for her comments and several of you who've commented. I want you to share the fact that we'll be here every week on Black Doctors Speak. I want you to remember, health is your biggest asset. So protect it, and we'll see you next week.